propose a method for exploring dynamic elements and structural relations within the system. The goal is actually to foster understanding of the underlying principles of formation processes as a method of exploring visual time-based possibilities articulated or not with oral elements. So the way I decided to make this presentation is actually a little bit different from the paper, because in the paper you can find more of the theoretical. So I'm taking advantage of an oral presentation to actually show a lot of movies and interactive things that would actually visually explain better the theories that I've written in the paper. So this paper, the presentation is actually, just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, is I'll briefly explain difference between visual form and visual formation, fundamentals of visual language, fundamentals of dynamic visual language, and then I'll show a case study to actually put in practice what I'm talking about and show some student work. A visual form is a time-independent spatial structure. Because there is no change with time, it is described only by spatial parameters. So we all know that, and here's just an example of a Poclay's painting from 1930. Point, line, plane, and volume are considered the basic elements of visual language and of geometry, and have been discussed in most books on visual language since the Bauhaus course in the 20s. Here's just to illustrate the point, a page from Poclay's notebooks on his course at Bauhaus, Weimar, in the beginning of the 20s, where he's actually talking about the point, the line, the plane, and the volume. Traditionally, a visual element is described by 7 basic attributes: shape, scale, orientation, position, tone, color, and texture. And in the static visual world, the basic elements, when combined with the 7 attributes, allow for the creation of virtually unlimited spatial possibilities in making meaning, such as we saw in the clay painting, and we are all familiar with paintings in general. So what is the difference then with a visual form and a visual formation? A visual formation engages the spatiality of visual form with a temporal dimension. It is time dependent in that it changes in time, such that later parts are dependent on earlier ones. Excuse me. In the continuous process of formation. So we are familiar with that in movies. So just to illustrate this point, actually there is a strip from Norman McLaren's film Dots from 1940. So what about the elements, right, of visual language? So the distinction between point, line, plane, and volume is no longer necessary or even valid in a dynamic environment where the spatial structure is a process which changes in time. In other words, each point, line, and plane is now one of many states in a dynamic visual formation. So we can basically only use even the terminology if we're looking at frames individually and not at the movie as a whole. So again, just to illustrate this point is Egelin's strip from Egelin's movie Dynamo Symphony from the early 20s. So what about the attributes in a dynamic visual language? So in a dynamic visual language, the 7 attributes as such, from my point of view, are not enough. The dimension of time must be incorporated in a way that space and time can no longer be isolated. What is proposed is a set of properties for each of the basic attributes, and properties are grouped in 3 separate but independent categories. And in order to explain that, I will actually move to an interactive interface. I would like just very briefly to say that I wrote a paper that was actually, there is a reference in the paper for SIGGRAPH that was published last year at Visible Language, the scholarly journal, and where you can find more details about what I'm talking here. I just want very briefly to show how this works. So if you look here, what you have, and I don't know, maybe it's not very visible, but here on top you have all the, actually 6 of the 7 attributes: shape, scale, orientation, position, tone, and color. And it's in 2 dimensions, so you have only X and Y for whatever use X and Y, such as shape and position. And for the category of spatial, what I'm proposing is exactly what we have already in the static visual world, which is called origin, which actually describes the beginning of the motion. So eventually you could change any of the parameters the same way that we do in the static visual world. So just reset that. So for the kinetic category, I'm proposing velocity, amplitude, and point of reference. So velocity is the rate of change for that attribute. So right now I'm actually, let me bring here a viewpoint, starting the viewpoint. I'm always working with the loop, so it actually the velocity, which is the speed and direction, goes in both directions because it's a loop. The point of reference is this point in the space to which the change in that attribute is changing, and obviously here is only 5, but it could be any place in the spatial structure. And amplitude is obviously amount of the extent of the motion, the change of that attribute. So for temporal, there is duration, which is the amount of time for the motion to complete, and start point. In this case, again, I'm showing the loop. So right now it starts from small to big. In this case, that we're changing the shape, and here it would, and eventually, because you could change things separately, or you could eventually change them individually, and obviously the infinity of possibilities would start if we start using all the other attributes and so on and so forth. So basically, again, I'm talking about fundamentals, so really what is underlying all these that we see in terms of education. So there's all other possibilities of talking about principles such as synchronicity. So here is just one module repeated for 90 times, and we have here first a pattern for tone, orientation, and scale. So some issues that are important to discuss in classroom environment, such as the way we perceive motion. So for example, here, the 49 elements in the tone pattern, we actually perceive as one single element because they are all in synchrony, they all start at the same point, and so on, and different levels of complexity are felt in the other two here. And obviously changing patterns and coming into an almost non-synchronous situation will build complexity and so on. So, well, actually, eventually there is this companion to the visible language where actually you can actually go to have more experiment with other more sophisticated, not so sophisticated, but at least have more fun in terms of what those properties allow you to do in an interactive way. And so the fundamentals point to the parameters that one needs to know in order to conceive and to create in time-based project, and they offer ways of exploring two basic inseparable processes. One is what I'm calling motion of forms, in other words, what changes in time, and the other forms of motion, how changes happen in time. So now I'll show a case study that illustrates the potential range of dynamic possibilities offered by the manipulation of these individual properties that I have been presenting. And the objective of the case study is actually to critically investigate and analyze the elements of time-based design vis-a-vis the proposed principles of dynamic visual language. And I have been using these in my class to actually teach time-based design. The case study used the Tonhalle posters designed by Joseph Müller-Brockmann, who is considered a pioneer of Swiss craft design. So I'm not going to enter into too much detail, but just give a very brief background for those of you who are not craft designers. He is Swiss craft design is a very important movement in craft design in the 50s and 60s, and still very influential nowadays. And Joseph Müller-Brockmann designed a series of posters for the Tonhalle, for the Zurich Concert Hall called Tonhalle, that he started for more than 25 years. All these posters are actually seminal in terms of the history of craft design. And the idea of using these in my case study is exactly because they announce music. And so that would be used as one of the parameters for talking about motion and creating the relationships between visual and oral elements. So in his words, and I'm quoting him here, he says that I try to interpret themes such as rhythm, transparency, weightlessness, and so on with concrete, abstract forms, which I brought together into logical relationships, had unified the geometrical elements in terms of form and proportion and the typography. Actually, the Swiss craft design, what they were trying to do was a very systematic, functional, and objective approach to communicating messages. So here are the posters that I'll be showing some animations and some systematic exploration that I use in the classroom. I don't use these as an assignment for students. I use these just to show the principles that I want to teach my students. So the case study, the idea of the case study is that they actually encourage 3 different levels of knowledge acquisition. One is the theoretical, which are the time-based principles that I've been talking about. The other is historical, which is using exemplary graph design solutions. And the other is practical, which is the exploration of time-based design and the articulation between visual and oral elements. So the movies are actually constrained by a series of very strict rules, and that goes from predictable to unpredictable, from simple to complex. And the rules are that the end of the movie equals the poster. The shapes that you see being animated only derive from the poster itself, and the music is actually coming from the poster, which is announced in the poster. So just very briefly, so in some cases, there are some studies that Muller-Brockman did in showing all the mathematical and geometrical ideas behind the design of the poster. And so there's a series of possibilities in terms of how this could be systematically explored. And this actually shows just, for example, just manipulating just one property, which is shape in this case, and it goes in a very sequential and predictable way, in other words. So it goes from outside in and from top to bottom. As soon as one ring gets formed, the other starts its process, and so on until the type appears. So just to show that, how I usually show a series of things to my class so that they understand the levels of predictability of when we're designing more complex animations. So this one is actually manipulating shape, scale, and orientation. The shape rings start from small until they get to their final scale, and keeps moving until the final shape. And I'll just basically very quickly move here. So just for you to show an idea of the idea. So here it's just using the same idea, but rather than being additive, it's actually subtractive. So and so in other words, the scale actually, rather than enlarging the scale, it's actually diminishing the scale. And this will go until it actually gets to the completion. So this final one that I'll show for this specifically poster, the Beethoven poster of 55, is actually using a music that actually now it's non-sequential, and actually the pacing, rather than being when one finished forming, the other starts, it's actually the pace is given by the music, which is the beginning of the 7th Symphony by Beethoven. Okay, so just show a few other ones that actually only have the music, because it's less boring to see all those very systematic explorations. This one actually used position, scale, and orientation in a poster design in 1953. And actually, there is always a concept behind, and this one is actually the constructive concept is the segregation between figure and ground. Obviously, when it starts, it's hard for, just to show that it's possible to create some ambiguity using simple things such as, lines can be overlapping of two circles and so on. And this one actually, stop this. So it actually manipulates shape, tone, and position, and the concept is just a grouping of similar elements. The next one, actually, I'll show two, and the idea here is only one property being manipulated, which is position. The concept always also derived from the posters themselves. In this case, the issue is just the position of colors and the grid. And so, in this case, I picked two different music announced from the poster. This one actually is Albanberg's Lyric Suite, and how actually the music can influence the way we design and animate the elements. So I'll show the two posters one after the other. So again, this one also used only one property being manipulated, which was a tone, and rather than gradient, it's just an on and off switch. This one is just position being manipulated, and actually just the concept of the loop, so all elements are in a loop. Okay, the last one actually shows just the possibility of animating separately the figures from the ground. Okay, so I would like to move just to show a few student work. It's, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, a course, time-based design course that I give at Northeastern University Department of Visual Arts for graphic design students. Students come to this course, and that's the first and eventually the only time that they actually explore motion graphics. So most of the students have never done any kind of animation or used any kind of software for animating. And I actually teach, as I give the course, I give tutorials on After Effects. And the class meets once a week, 3.5 hours for 14 weeks. And so the course investigates conceptual, visual, and technical aspects of motion graphics. It's an exploration of the elements of design in time-based media, the use of typography, image, and sound in the creation of meaning through spatial and temporal relationships. So it's very objective in terms of communicating messages with specific goals and for specific audiences. So I'll show some works. The first one, and I'll just put the sound a little bit lower so that I can speak while I show some work. So this one is by Dan Nolan. He did it, and wow. This assignment is actually called a graph design exhibit. So I ask students to choose a graph designer, study their work. It can be a period in time or a graph design or a theme. And they actually have to study, select a series of works, imagine a possible venue for that exhibition, that imaginary exhibition, and then create a preview. So they are basically working with someone else's images, who is also a graph designer, and or it could be a web designer, it doesn't matter. They have to, the goal is actually to get the audience to come to this imaginary exhibition. And they actually, for the first time, have to use sound. It can be any kind of sound, like a narration or music. In this example, actually, since he was working with a German designer, he actually chose Prokofiev that was related to the kind of work that this particular designer was doing. I'll show another work by the same student. This assignment is the third assignment. That one that I showed before is the second assignment. This third assignment is also actually students have to choose a social cause that they have to create a movie, and that can be anything from environment, from political issues, health issues, prejudice, anything. And they actually have to study the issue, statistics, or any other way that they want to communicate that message. The goal is actually to have the audience adopting the value of the movie. So for this case, actually, they actually use their own images. In this case, Dan took photographs, and they have to write their own message and animate it. In this particular case, Dan also collaborated with a student of music who actually composed the sound design for this piece. It's Sam Bogart. Okay, this one is for the same assignment, and in this particular case, the student decided to animate everything. So as you see, it really depends on the concept of the student and how they want to deliver their message. Just stop very briefly because I'm playing against time, and I just want to show the other ways that students actually explore those messages. So there are people that actually, I'm not going, this is actually an assignment from a student that did this 3 years ago, and it was actually less about communicating a message, but they had to actually create relationships between sound and sound. So, for example, in this assignment, Stephen Hatch decided to go into the 3D environment of After Effects, which was 3 years ago, which was still very primitive way of dealing with that, and still is in After Effects. But just to very briefly show how the students deal differently with different subjects. And this student, again, it was the first time dealing with After Effects, so I would be happy to show this later on. I just don't have time. I just want very quickly to show, so I allow some time for questions. This student actually, okay, I'm just very briefly finish this. I just want to conclude to say that the paper proposed a pedagogical framework for teaching and learning principles of time-based design, and examined time-based design as a system, and proposed a method for exploring dynamic elements and structural relations within the system. The focus was on making the dynamic forms as the most appropriate process for conceiving and creating time-based design projects. It could be argued that the systematic exploration of concepts through the making of dynamic forms is beneficial to training the eye to see motion abstractly, expanding the mind to conceive of unexpected forms of motion, and constructing effective dynamic messages. I'd like to thank you and thank my students for allowing me to show the work here, and thank you for coming. Thank you. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yeah.